Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I am Dr. Iram Imran, Professor and Head of Department Physiology at FRPMC. My email address is drerunimran@gmail.com. Today the topic of discussion is action potential. Actually, I have got two lectures on action potential, but I have merge the two lectures in one presentation. So this is my action potential 1 and 2. If you have any queries, you can contact me on my email address. Now, what are the learning objectives of this lecture? Define action potential and discuss the role of voltage gated sodium and potassium channels for the generation of action potential. Explain the phases of action potential. Discuss the role of sodium-potassium pump in action potential. Differentiate between graded and action potential. Explain the propagation of action potential in myelinated and unmyelinated nerve fibers. Discuss the properties of action potential, which includes both the all or none principle and the refractory period. Discuss the phases of refractory period, cause of their occurrence and its importance. Now, what actually is the action potential? We can define action potential as a brief, rapid, large change in membrane potential during which the potential reverses and becomes positive and then restored back to resting state. Now look at here. This is my resting membrane potential is at minus 90. So now you know that this RMP is in the case of skeletal muscles. Actually, the sequence of events occurring all in neuron and in muscles is same. In skeletal muscles and neurons, all the processes of action potential is same. So whether you study on neuron or in the skeletal muscle, it's same. And for the cardiac and the smooth muscle, you will see there are some changes in the action potential, but for the skeletal muscle and for the neuron, all the events which are occurring in the neuron, they are exactly same for the skeletal muscle. So some of the graphs you will find that will be of neuron and others will be of skeletal muscle. There is no difference, only the values are different. So here you can see that it's minus 90 millivolts. So this action potential graph is actually shown in the skeletal muscles, and now this is actually minus 90, which is a resting membrane potential. We derived that how this resting membrane potential is derived. It is derived by the concentration, 80% by the concentration gradient of sodium and potassium, in which there is more role of the potassium moving down the concentration gradient and less role of sodium. And what happens that when this minus 90, how it reaches a threshold value. Now this is minus 65, which is a threshold for action potential in the skeletal muscles. In the neuron, we did that RMP was minus 70 and the threshold was minus 55. But in the skeletal muscle, the RMP is at minus 90 and threshold is at minus 65. So how from minus and at the threshold the action potential is triggered because there is opening of voltage gated channels at the threshold. So from 90 to minus 65, how this potential change occur? This potential change occur by means of the local potential or the graded potential. So what happens? The graded potential occurs due to opening of ligand gated, mechanically gated or thermally gated channel. So any of these channels, they are present, and these channels when open, what happens that inside become positivity, sodium influx occur, which causes a slight degree of not to exactly the positivity, they decrease in the negativity, and the potential rises from minus 90 towards the threshold if the stimulus is the threshold is stimulus. If it is sub-threshold stimulus, the threshold will not be reached and the action potential will not be fired. But if the stimulus is given over here, okay, this is a stimulus is given at this point, and when the stimulus is given, It may be in the form of opening, either it may be a chemical substance which binds with the receptors, and sodium channels are open and causes a slight degree of depolarization, and potential then moves towards the threshold if the stimulus strength is at the threshold stimulus. So when the threshold is reached at minus 65, now the change in voltage is going, this change in voltage from minus 90 to minus 65 is going to open the voltage gated channels, and opening of the voltage gated channels, now they will move the potential. You can see it is going, it's a brief, a rapid, large change in potential during which it becomes positive. You can see it becomes positive, and then it goes back to the resting state, and this condition is known as the action potential. So action potential always starts at the threshold, it moves, it reverses its polarity, means from negative to it becomes positive, and then back to a resting state. This state is known as the action potential. The action potential, unlike the graded potential, they do not decrease in strength, as we will see that how they are propagated, that they are not decrease in strength with distance, so they serve as long distance signals, in contrast to graded potentials which were short lived, and they travel in a decremental fashion, and they die out after some time, and if they are not reaching the threshold, they will not fire the action potential. So events of action potential generation and transmission, they are same for skeletal muscles and neurons. As I told you, in smooth muscles and cardiac muscles, there are few changes. When you will study those muscles, you will see over there that what changes in action potential are present in those muscles. But in the skeletal muscles and neurons, you will find similar action potential events, so they are discussed together. The only difference I told you is the values. In the skeletal muscle, the RMP is at minus 90 and threshold is minus 65. In the neurons, the RMP is minus 70 millivolts and the threshold is about minus 55 millivolts. It's less negative in neurons. Now, initiation of action potential, I told you there must be a triggering event or a triggering agent which causes the membrane to depolarize, means to move towards the positivity from the resting state of minus 90 to a threshold value of minus 65. At threshold, what will happen? There will be opening of voltage gated channels and explosive depolarization is going to occur, because tremendous amount of sodium is going to get inside through these voltage gated channels. So action potential is not going to occur until the initial rise in membrane potential reaches a threshold value. Okay, as we discussed, from RMP till threshold, this is reached by the graded potential, which is occurring by the opening of either of any three channels. Some neurons, they respond to chemical stimulus, some respond to thermal stimulus, some respond to what is another mechanical one, mechanical, chemical and thermal. Okay, so whenever there is a depolarization in membrane potential, there is opening of few voltage gated channels, sodium influx occur, further change in potential occur, and further opening of voltage gated channels. So there is a positive feedback mechanism in the action potential, that whenever the membrane gets depolarized to a threshold value, the sodium channels, voltage gated channels open, and the opening of voltage gated channels causes the influx of positive ions, sodium ions, they move inside, and further change in membrane potential, which causes the opening of more and more of the channels, causing more positivity, and this leads to a positive feedback cycle. So you must have studied in the chapter of hemostasis that once the action potential starts, there is a positive feedback in the muscle or the neuron. So what actually happens, that you know that in the resting state, more potassiums, they are leaving out the cell. Okay, because membrane is more permeable to potassium, so there is negativity. So if potassium leaving out of the cell is not going to stop at the even at during the action potential, because these are the leak channels and they are always open. But what is happening at the action potential, that number of sodium entering the cell through the voltage gated channel, to the voltage gated channels, is tremendously increased. So the positive ions, they are also leaking out in the form of potassium ion, but the sodium influx is so much that it creates a positive potential inside. So we saw that in during the action potential, the membrane potential from negative moves to positive, and then it restored back to the resting state. So this all phases, they are known as the action potential. So this stimulus, it can be at a subthreshold stimulus, means it is too weak and it doesn't produce a response. Okay, but if it is at a threshold stimuli, means this minimal stimulus that can produce excitation is known as threshold. At the stimulus must be at a threshold value to excite the membrane. Okay, for the electrical signals to be generated, the threshold stimulus is going to excite, and that threshold stimulus is the minimum stimulus that can produce excitation. Okay, and at the threshold, the occurrence of action potential is inevitable. Now the action potential is going to start. Okay, the threshold stimulus is needed to start or to generate which type of electrical signal? It is used to start the action potential. For the action potential, you need the threshold stimulus. Okay, sub threshold stimulus will not start action potential. It will generate the graded potential, but it will not generate the action potential. For the action potential to occur, you need a threshold stimulus, which is the minimum strength of a stimulus that can produce excitation or the action potential. So we discussed that action potential takes place as a result of opening and closure of two specific type of channels. Actually, the type is one, voltage gated, but the voltage gated channels, they are of two types. Okay, so voltage gated channels, they are responsible for generation of action potential, and those are voltage gated sodium channels and voltage gated potassium channels. Before we move on to the action potential, first we discuss these channels in details, that what are the functions of voltage gated sodium channels and what are the characteristics actually of the voltage gated potassium channels. So we discussed that there are two types of voltage gated channels which are responsible for the generation of action potential in the neurons and in the skeletal muscles. We are talking about only these two excitable cells, that is the skeletal muscles and the neurons. So these are the most important channels during action potential. It has two gates. Now these are the two gates. Now this is the voltage gated sodium channels. You can see that it has got two gates, the activation gates and the inactivation gates. Okay, so in the red, they are the activation gates. You can remember that since sodium is more outside, so activity is occurring outside, no? Okay, so if by this you can remember that activation gates, they are towards the outside. This is inside, this is inside, and this is outside, means this is ECF and this is ICF. Sodium is always moved down the concentration gradient from outside to inside. So this is the gradient, it coming from outside to inside, and the activation gates, they are towards outside. Now during RMP, resting membrane potential, I told you at the resting membrane potential, there is no activity occurring through the voltage gated channels because the activation gates, they are closed, the inactivation gates, they are open. Okay, the inactivation gates of sodium are open, but they are useless because since the activation gates are closed, so sodium is not going to move inside. Okay, so this is very important point, that the activation gates at RMP, these activation gates, they are closed, so no sodium is going to influx at RMP through these channels, although they are leaking through the leak channels, but they cannot enter via voltage gated sodium channels, they are closed. Now when they open, as you all know that they open at the threshold value. At the threshold value, what happens, that the activation gates, they open when membrane potential becomes less negative and it reaches a threshold value. Then the activation gates open and large amount of sodium is going to open, and due to this the membrane permeability increases for sodium to about 500 to 5000 folds. there is tremendous increase in the permeability of sodium. At the resting state, there was more permeability for the potassium, but because there were more leak channels for the potassium. But here, during action potential, when the threshold level is reached, what happened? That large number of voltage gated sodium channels, they open at the threshold, and what happens? The activation gates are opening. Now, when the activation gates are opening, the inactivation gates, they are also closing at that time. Okay, opening of the activation gates will causes the inactivation gates to close, but the opening of the activation gate is faster as compared to closure. So a time will come when this state is reached. This state, during this state, you can see that both the same stimulus, that is the threshold value, is responsible for opening of these channels, these activation gates, and closure of inactivation gate. But opening is a faster process. So it opens, but still the inactivation gates are not closed. So large amount of sodium influx will occur and increasing the positivity inside the cell. Okay, and then the inactivation gates close, and this in sorry yes inactivation gates, now they are closed and activation gates are open. So now this state is reached. Now let's discuss the we did the inactivation gates. That same threshold value that opened the activation gates also closes the inactivation gates, but inactivation, I told you, is closure, as inactivation gates is a slow process and closure of gate is slower as compared to opening, so which leads to increase in amount of sodium influx. Now second feature is very important, that this inactivation gate is now closed. Now once the inactivation gate is closed, nothing can open the inactivation gate again unless the RMP is reached. When the resting membrane potential is reached, then only the inactivation gate open and the activation gate close. So if you want to restore back this position of the voltage gated sodium channel, the membrane potential must reach back to the RMP value, that is the resting value, to open the inactivation gate and to close the activation gates. So this is actually the opening and closing of the activation and the inactivation gates of the voltage gated sodium channels. Okay. Now the next channels are the voltage gated potassium channels. Like the sodium channels, these voltage gated potassium channels, they are also closed at the RMP, and they have got only one gate. Yes, important point, they don't have the two gates, they just have a single gate which is towards inside. Potassium is more inside, so remember that its gate is towards inside of the membrane. So during the resting state, these potassium channels, they are closed, so no potassium is going to move out from these channels during at the resting membrane potential. That's why during resting state, no activity is occurring to by means of these voltage gated channels. But the same stimulus which causes the membrane potential to reach a threshold will open both the voltage gated channels. It is going to, it's a stimulus for opening. The threshold potential is actually the stimulus for the opening of both the voltage gated and the potassium gated, and the sodium voltage gated and potassium voltage gated, both the channels they should open. But the voltage gated sodium channels, they do open at the threshold, but the voltage gated potassium channels, they are slow to open and slow to close. Okay, they are slow in both the functions, that opening is also slower and closure is also slower. Okay, so they open a little late in the during the action potential. They open at the time when the voltage gated sodium channels, they are closing due to the closure of inactivation gate. Okay, so we will see that what are the different phases of action potential. We will see different phases of action potential. They are depolarization or repolarization and hyperpolarization. So now what happened during these phases? We will discuss each of these phases with the also with the voltage gated channels, and we will see this graph of the action potential. Now this is the time and this is the voltage. We can see that at RMP the voltage is shown over here is minus 90. So it means that this activity is occurring in the skeletal muscle. The threshold is reached at minus 65 by the graded potential or the local change in potential. And then what happened at this point? The voltage gated sodium channels open. I told you that this is the stimulus for opening of both the channels, but voltage gated potassium channels, they are slow to open and slow to close. They do not open over here. They do not open here. Okay. They remain closed. They are in the process of opening. Okay. But they haven't opened that to move the potassium through the channels. Okay. So what happens that here the voltage gated sodium channels open. Sodium moves inside and its permeability increases about 500 to 5000 times as it was during the resting state. So its permeability increases and it moves tremendous amount of sodium inside, and it's the opening of which gate you can see at the rest at the activation gates were closed. Okay, so when this threshold level is reached, the activation gates now they are opening, which results in this upstroke. This is going towards positivity, and this state is known as the depolarization phase of the action potential. And which channel is responsible for the depolarization phase? If this MCQs come, what you will write? It's the role of sodium ions through the voltage gated sodium channels. Okay, so depolarization phase is due to the opening of activation gates of the voltage gated sodium channels. Now what happens at this peak? At this peak, the voltage gated potassium channels open and the inactivation gate of sodium close. Okay, because I told you activation is the faster process. Activation gates open earlier and the closure of inactivation gates, they are slow. So this closure occurs at which point? At this peak. At peak, two things is happening. In the voltage gated potassium channels are opening and the inactivation gates of sodium are closing. Okay, so at this point when the voltage gated potassium channels open, the potassium going to leak out, or don't use the word leak out, it is going to move out from these voltage gated potassium channels. And more potassium when leaks out, the positivity will move out of the cell. What will happen? That the membrane potential will restore back to its RMP, that is the resting potential. It will reach back to minus 90, and this repolarization is due to closure of inactivation gate of sodium and opening of voltage gated potassium channels. Everyone got it? So repolarization means restoring the RMP back. Okay, so but you can see that the voltage gated potassium channels, as I told you, they are slow to open. They open at the peak of action potential, and they must be closed at the resting state, but they do not close at the resting state. They remain open for some time because they are slow to close. And what happens that this you can see, they remain open, which causes slight more amount of potassium to move out, which creates a slightly more negative potential than RMP, and that potential is known as hyperpolarization. Okay, now at this RMP, what happens? This RMP will restore the voltage gated sodium channels back to their normal resting state, that the inactivation gate is open and the activation gate is closed. So now during hyperpolarization, what is the cause of now let's discuss the cause of each. What is the cause of depolarization? Movement of sodium inside the cell through the voltage gated sodium channels. What is the cause of repolarization? Movement of potassium out of the cell and closure of sodium channels, and movement of potassium outside the cell by the opening of voltage gated potassium channel. And hyperpolarization is due to slow closure of potassium channels. Okay, so now how it is restored back then again to the resting state? Which thing maintained the resting state? Now this is maintained again by the sodium potassium pump. So this was becoming about minus 100. During repolarization, the voltage become more negative, that is minus 100, and it again go back to minus 90, or it is maintained, and the resting state is maintained by the sodium potassium pump. All the sodium which has moved inside and potassium moves outside, now this their concentration gradient is maintained by sodium potassium pump, which maintain their levels outside and inside the cell. Okay, this picture summarizes all the events and the phases which of the action potential. Starting from here, this is actually the resting membrane potential. At the resting membrane potential, both the voltage gated sodium and the potassium channels, you can see they are closed. Activation gates are closed, and here also the gates of potassium, they are closed. Then the threshold is reached by the graded potential. Here opening of voltage gated sodium channels occur, and sodium influx, which is responsible for the rising phase or the depolarization phase. Now the sodium is coming inside at a peak. What is happening? That voltage gated sodium channels, they are now inactivation gates are closed, and the voltage gated potassium channel open. Potassium moves out, which is causing which is causing repolarization, and repolarization bring the membrane potential back to the RMP. So at the RMP, the voltage gated sodium channels, they were restored back to their normal state, that the activation gates, they are closed, but the inactivation gate open, they retain their normal position, and the voltage gated potassium channels, they closed slowly, that's why they remain open, leading to a state of hyperpolarization, means more negativity. And once the RMP is reached, which is maintained actually by the sodium potassium pump, again at this point the voltage gated potassium channels now closes. So this is the brief summary of the events of action potential. I told you what is the function of sodium potassium pump, that it maintains the resting membrane potential. Now it in the after the action potential is over, there is ionic disturbances. Repolarization is going to restore the resting membrane potential. We have reached again back to the resting membrane potential, and another stimulus is going to occur, and similar uh, pattern is going to occur, that again the depolarization and repolarization is going to take place, and again the muscle of the neuron will get come on to the rest and ready for next stimulus. But what happens to the ionic condition? I told you that sodium has moved inside and potassium has moved outside. So this ionic disturbance which has occurred during the action potential is restored by sodium potassium pump, which pump back the sodium outside and potassium inside. So what happened in case of calcium deficiency? What happens actually, the calcium levels in the blood, they are very important for the voltage gated sodium channels. The concentration of calcium ions in the ECF, in the blood or in the ECF, has very important effect on the voltage gated sodium channel. Actually, what does the calcium do? That it binds to the exterior surface of the voltage gated sodium channels. Calcium binds to the exterior surface of the voltage gated sodium channels and make their opening difficult. So when there is a normal level of calcium, nothing will happen. But when there is a deficiency of calcium, the condition is known as hypocalcemia. Hypo means low, calcemia means low calcium in the blood. Calcemia means calcium in the blood. When there is hypocalcemia, means when there is low calcium in the blood or in the ECF, what will happen? Now there will be less amount of calcium which is going to bind with the voltage gated sodium channels. So the voltage gated sodium channels, they will open very easily. Okay, there is no hindrance because less number of calcium ions in the blood, they will bind with the less voltage gated sodium channels. So these voltage gated channels can open very fast, actually we can say. So the nerve fiber will become highly excitable because of overactivity of the voltage gated sodium channels. And if it is below 50%, what will happen? Without the stimulus, there is no stimulus, and it will, the nerves, they are going to discharge, they will send the impulses, and this condition leads to muscle spasm. When there is excessive discharge, when there is excessive action potential going on inside the muscles, they get because nerves, they are connected with the muscles and a neuromuscular junction. So when nerve is overexcited, the muscle gets overexcited, and this leads to the muscle spasm and muscles get contracted. And if the respiratory muscle get into a state of spasm, what will happen? You know that during respiration, the muscles, they contract and they should relax. For inspiration, the contraction occurs, and then for relaxation, the muscle should relax. But here there is a constant spasm of the muscles. So if there is involvement of respiratory muscle, then a person can die due to a disease which is known as tetany. Tetany is actually a disease which occurs due to hypocalcemia, when the serum calcium levels, they fall very much low, below 50% their normal value, and this leads to a condition which is known as tetany. It can be lethal if it involves the respiratory muscles. So now let's discuss the effect of hypokalemia on membrane potential in nerve and muscle. Actually, the normal range for the potassium levels in the blood is from 3.5 millimoles to 5 millimoles per liter. Okay, 3.5 to 5 here. If it is less than 3.5, the condition is known as hypokalemia. Hypo means less, kalemia means potassium in the blood. So whenever its level decreases below 3.5 millimoles per liter or milliequivalent per liter, we say that condition is known as hypokalemia. Since actually there is a less potassium in the blood, so potassium gradient is going to increase between ECF and ICF, and more potassium is going to leak out, which creates more negative RMP as a result of potassium leakage. So this more negative RMP leads to hyperpolarization. Here you can see that there is a low potassium in the ECF. The RMP here is minus 90. Now due to low potassium, RMP has become more negative due to increase in the gradient of potassium between ECF and ICF. So the membrane is now far away from the threshold value, so membrane become less excitable and leading to muscle weakness and paralysis and fatigue. Okay, so low muscle, depending on the levels of potassium, very low levels, they are very dangerous, and they should be treated as they are very low level of potassium is a medical emergency and should be treated. Now let's see what is the effect of hyperkalemia. So hyperkalemia means increased level of potassium in the blood. Normal it was 4, and then if it becomes more than 5 millimoles per liter, it means that the condition is known as hyper. Hyper means more, kalemia is potassium in blood, so more potassium in the blood above about 5 milliequivalents per liter or 5 millimoles per liter. So what happens when potassium is elevated in the blood? Inside it is 140, and outside it is about 5 millivolts, I'm saying it is about 5 milliequivalents per liter. So what will happen? The gradient is now decreased, so less potassium is going to leak out, which leads to less negative RMP. Here you can see the RMP is less negative. Okay, so as less potassium leaks out, so you are closer to the threshold value, so that muscle is going to be more excitable, and it is very much easily excitable. But at the same time, it remains so much in the excited phase that it prevents the repolarization, because you know that sodium channels, they become inactivated at the peak of depolarization. At the peak of action potential, they become inactivated, and for their activation again the RMP must be reached. Okay, because RMP is the state when the inactivation gates are open. So sodium channels will not be activated because they remain in the prolonged state, remaining in the actually the muscle due to prolonged repolarization. The voltage gated sodium channels, they get inactivated, and for their activation again the RMP must be restored. Since here the RMP is not restored, so what will happen? The sodium channels, they get inactivated and leads to muscle weakness and paralysis and cardiac arrhythmias. So ultimately both the conditions leading to problem in the action potential, because action potential will not be generated, leading to muscle weakness and cardiac arrhythmias. In the heart it causes arrhythmias, in the muscle it causes muscle weakness. So although you can see that the membrane potential is actually closer to the threshold value in the hyperkalemia, initially there is excitability is increased, but after some time what will happen, that excitability is going to decrease, because due to prolonged excitability or prolonged action potential, the sodium channels, they get inactivated, and since the depolarization phase is not occurring, the membrane is always in the depolarized phase. So that's why due to lack of repolarization, the sodium channels will not be activated and leading to muscle weakness and paralysis and cardiac arrhythmias. So the membrane stabilizers, the factors which reduces the membrane excitability, they are known as membrane stabilizers. Now which factors which reduce the membrane excitability? First thing we discussed, hypocalcemia, which increases the membrane excitability, and opposite is true for hypercalcemia. Hypercalcemia decreases the membrane excitability. So this hypercalcemia acts as a stabilizer. Moreover, the local anesthetics, there are local anesthetics which are named as, these are the drugs which are applied to the skin and which produce anesthesia of the skin, means the loss of sensation occurs in that part. So if someone is feeling a pain, what we do, we apply these local anesthetics to that painful area. Like example, they are lidocaine, procaine, tetracaine. What they do, these local anesthetic, they block the voltage gated sodium channels. So what happens once this channels are blocked, so the action potential there, it's not going to occur. So because they decrease the membrane excitability, leading to so nerve impulse fail to pass through this anesthetized nerves. You can see here the example is that is action potential was traveling, but here it comes and it is blocked. Why? Because here there we have applied the local anesthetic which block the voltage gated voltage gated channels, sodium channels, and since the voltage gated sodium channels are blocked, so action potential is not going to occur and membrane excitability is going to decrease. So action potential is not traveling, look, it is not traveling beyond this part. So this local anesthetic, they are decreasing the membrane excitability. So that's why the factors I told you that which reduces the membrane excitability, they are known as membrane stabilizers. So local anesthetics act as membrane stabilizers by causing the nerve impulse to actually by stopping the nerve signal to pass through the anesthetized nerves. Now, how the action potential is propagated from one point, I told you that action potential serve as a long distance signals, and it moves, it travels long distance, and how it travels, how it propagated. Actually, the action potential only now this is the action potential. It starts at a small portion of the total membrane, and then it is self-propagating. It propagates itself and it moves away from the point of stimulus. For example, this is the region where the action potential started. So as I told you, in the neuron, it started at the trigger zone. But how this action potential reaches the axon terminal? Okay, so this is this traveling of the action potential is known as the propagation or the conduction of action potential, that it is conducted from its site of origin to the rest of the muscle or the nerve fiber membrane, and this is known as propagation or conduction of action potential. And this conduction and propagation of action potential is this conduction of action potential or propagation of action potential is different in case of the unmyelinated and myelinated nerve fibers. So it is of two types, the contiguous conduction and saltatory conduction. So contiguous conduction occurs if they are the unmyelinated nerve fibers, and if the nerve fibers they are myelinated fibers, the conduction known as the saltatory conduction. We will do in detail both the contiguous type of conduction and the saltatory type of conduction. We discussed that action potential starts at a single point and then it propagates itself away from the site of origin. How it propagates, how it is conducted is different in different type of nerve fibers. In unmyelinated type, the type of conduction is known as contiguous conduction, and the type of conduction which occurs in the myelinated nerve fibers is known as saltatory conduction. So this picture is showing us the continuous type of conduction. Now we have discussed that the graded potential started over here in the axonal soma or in the dendrites. This moves and come in the trigger zone. Now here is the trigger zone where I told you voltage gated sodium channels and both the potassium channels, they are present at the trigger zone, and once the graded potential is at threshold or more than threshold, the action potential is going to start at this trigger zone. During the action potential, you know that the inside become positive due to the movement of the sodium ions, and the rest of the membrane is still negative because it is in the resting state. Now this what happened, this is actually the relatively the inactive area. Okay, now what happened, now since there is a flow of charges, the current is always going to flow. Now these sodium ions, they move further, and they what will do, they will depolarize this adjacent area, adjacent inactive area. Okay, and when this area reaches a threshold value, what will happen over here? Here also the voltage gated sodium channels will open and sodium is going to move inside. Okay, again these flow of charges, they will move further and they will depolarize the membrane adjacent to this area, and this is how the action potential is going to travel throughout, since each part is reaching the threshold value because it's a high value, and there is always the opening of voltage gated sodium channel at the next level at this area which was initially inactive. The movement of sodium ions is so much that at this level the threshold is reached, and also the voltage gated sodium channels open at this level also, and the action potential will generated in this side of the membrane also. So direction of the action potential is away from this trigger zone. You can see that action potential is moving like this and moving at the axon terminal. Now this is the more good picture. You can see here that this now your action potential has propagated over here. Okay, initially it started at this zone, which is the trigger zone. Here it was positive. Okay, now it has moved to this side. Now when it has moved to this side, I told you that the threshold is reached over here, and then more sodium ions, they will move inside, and this area will also get activated. Now this flow of charges occurs, and the flow ions will move further, and they will now depolarize this adjacent area, and this area now will reach the threshold, and the voltage gated sodium channels will open, and the action potential now propagates further. But what happens to the membrane which is far behind? You can see that this membrane, what happened to this membrane, that when the voltage gated sodium channels they reach the peak, I told you, then what happens, the voltage gated potassium channels open. So at the peak of depolarization, voltage gated potassium channel are open and potassium is moving out. So the previously which were active area has now become again negative because its resting RMP has restored back due to the opening of the voltage gated potassium channels. So the previous area is now inactive. Now this area is active, this middle one, and now it is going to activate the new area which is adjacent to it. So this is how the previous area is going to become negative because of restoration of the RMP. And this transmission of depolarization wave, this how the depolarization wave is moving along a nerve or muscle is known as impulse. This wave of depolarization is known as a nerve or along the nerve or the muscle fiber is known as nerve impulse or a muscle impulse. So action potential in the axon is known as nerve impulse, and it is the way that neurons communicate. So how the action potential is moving and then it is exciting the other neurons, and this is known as nerve impulse. Okay, now let's discuss the process of propagation in the myelinated nerve fibers. But before going to that process, that is known as the saltatory conduction, before going to that process, what is myelination and how it is formed? Actually, myelin is nothing but it's a sheet insulator or a sheet which is formed by the two type of cells in the nerve fibers. If they are present in the central nervous system, the myelin sheet is formed by the cells known as oligodendrocytes, and if the nerve fibers are in the peripheral nervous system, their myelin sheet is formed by the Schwann cells. Both of these cells, they are rich in lipid. Their cell membrane is rich in the lipid type which is known as sphingomyelin. What they do is, here is given the example of Schwann cell. The process is same in both the cells, oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells. What they do, that they wrap around the axon. This is in yellow color, you can see this is axon, and the cell, the Schwann cell, it wrap around the axon multiple times like a Swiss roll, and when it wrap around, it forms a thick insulation like this, and this insulation is known as the myelin. Now here you can see this is the nerve fiber and surrounding is the myelin sheet. It's same as like the electrical wires, they are being insulated by the plastic. Okay, so to prevent the leakage of the current. So what is the function of this myelin sheet? It acts as an insulator which prevents the passage of current, ions. Current is in the form of, here is it is in the form of ions. Actually the charges, they are in the form of ions. So it prevents the passage of ions across the membrane because it is made up of lipid which is known as sphingomyelin. So water soluble ions, they cannot cross that membrane, so current is not going to leak out in the from these through the membrane of this myelin sheet. Okay, so current is not going to leak, and that's why this process is known as myelination, and it helps in the insulation of the axons. You can see how the axons, they are insulated by presence of this myelin sheet. So action potential. So what happens when ions, they are not going to leak? So myelin sheet is here, you can see that the myelin sheet is interrupted at some distance. You can see that this is myelin sheet, this is myelin sheet. In between these two sheets you can find a space where the myelin sheet is not present, and that point is known as node of Renvier. This node of Renvier has got tremendous amount of voltage gated channels which are responsible for the generation of action potential. If the MCQs come that highest number of voltage gated sodium channels are present at which point, soma, axon, trigger zone or node of Renvier, your answer will be node of Renvier. Means that the voltage gated sodium channels or the voltage gated sodium and potassium channels, they are more concentrated at the node of Renvier. Even they are more higher as compared to the trigger zone. They were higher at the trigger zone to start the action potential, but they are also present in the highest number at the node of Renvier. Okay, so maximum number of voltage gated channels, they are present at the node of Renvier. So in this node of Renvier, and this is the portion of the axon where myelin sheath is not present. Now, what are the two ways by which the action potential speed is increased? Okay, the action potential travels at a faster speed if the diameter of the axon is more. Naturally, if there is a larger diameter of the axon, what will happen? There is less resistance to the current flow. Okay, and the current is going to flow at a higher speed. So action potential propagates at higher speed when the diameter of the nerve fiber is more, and second is the myelination of the fiber. We will see how the myelin sheath is responsible for the speed, for the high speed of action potential conduction. Okay, so diameter, it depends, speed of the action potential depends on two things. One is the diameter of the nerve fiber, and second is the myelination of the nerve fibers. So in case of myelinated nerve fiber, how the action potential occur? The action potential actually jump from one node to another node. It occurs in the jumping manner. The word saltatory means to jump. Okay, so it is jumping from one place to another. So what is happening there? The action potential, since it's occurring in the jumping manner in the myelinated nerve fiber, so it occurs at a higher speed as compared to unmyelinated fibers. I told you there are two things for the increase in the velocity of action potential. One is this resistance, that is the diameter, and second is the myelination. So more diameter, less resistance, more speed of the action potential, easy. Second is that when the myelinated nerve fiber is there, the action potential actually jumps because because only the voltage gated channels, they are only present at the node of Renvier. So action potential occurs in the jumping manner. So it moves faster. Naturally, when we jump, we move faster. So as compared while we are walking. So in action potential will occurs in a jumping manner in the myelinated nerve fiber. So speed of the conduction velocity is going to increase in case of myelinated nerve fibers. So how it occurs, we can see that word saltatory means to jump or to leap. Okay, so you can see action potential is occurring only at the nodes of Renvier. Now what is actually happening over here, that now I told you that this is the trigger zone. Here the action potential starts. Here the voltage gated channels open, sodium influx occur. Now these sodium ions, they flow, they because since this area has got the myelin sheath and there are no voltage gated channels, so they sodium ions, they now move over here. They travel and come over here, and when they come here, this membrane reaches a threshold value, and it opens the, because there are so many voltage gated channels, they open and they bring the membrane to the threshold. The membrane is reached by the threshold by the movement of sodium ions, and this opens the voltage gated sodium channel, and this leads to action potential. This action potential, then what happens, these sodium ions, they jump and they come over here and they open the voltage gated channels over here, and the voltage gated channels open here, and the membrane gets excited, or the action potential occur at this side. Now at this side, so this is occurring in the jumping manner from one node of Renvier to another node of Renvier, and such type of propagation which is occurring in the jumping manner like a frog. Okay, like a frog is in a jumping manner from one node of Renvier to another is known as saltatory conduction. So myelinated nerve fibers conduct impulse 50 times faster than the unmyelinated nerve fibers of same size. Means if the two fibers are there, one is myelinated and one is unmyelinated, and their size is same, so which one is going to conduct impulse faster? The myelinated is going to conduct impulse 50 times faster as compared to unmyelinated nerve fibers with same size. So in myelinated nerve fibers, the conduction velocity is increased, not only due to the action potential occurs in the jumping manner, but also that the membrane is actually insulated, because axonal membrane is insulated by means of the myelin sheath, so the ions, they cannot leak out. they remain inside. There is less leakage of ions as compared to unmyelinated fibers because there was no insulation, so current was leaked over there. But here the current is not leaked. All the positive ions which they remain inside, no ions, less ion flow occurs, so the outside, or the less ions they leak out, so the threshold is reached earlier and the action potential propagates in a very smooth manner without the ions being leaked out. So action potential is faster in case of saltatory conduction, and it's slower in case of, it's about 50 times faster in case of myelinated nerve fibers. And what are the importance of saltatory conduction? First, we did that it increased the conduction velocity and speed up the action potential, moves faster in case of myelinated nerve fibers as compared to unmyelinated nerve fibers. So, the information which is going to the brain, which requires the speed, because that information should go to the brain very quickly. All the information from the brain to the periphery, if it is going coming to the periphery, and the signals which need to move very fast, they are traveling via myelinated nerve fibers. Okay, so, and second function is it conserves energy for the exome. Now, how it conserves the energy? As I told you that in the after the action potential is over, the ionic disturbance which has occurred, that sodium has moved inside and potassium has gone outside. So this ionic disturbance is corrected by the sodium potassium pump, which pump back the sodium and the sodium out and pump back the potassium in. So this pump requires energy because sodium potassium pump is the example of primary active transport, which needs ATP. Because it is moving the ions against the gradient, it requires energy in the form of ATP. Since ionic disturbances as will be more in case of unmyelinated nerve fiber, and less in the myelinated nerve fiber, because in myelinated nerve fibers only the nodes are actually the disturbance occur only at the nodes. So ionic disturbance is less because the action potential is occurring only at the nodes. So less ionic disturbance is occurring in case of myelinated nerve fiber. So less ATP has to work for less ATP is needed by the myelinated nerve fibers as compared to unmyelinated nerve fibers. So energy is being conserved in case of myelinated nerve fibers. So there is a disease, multiple sclerosis, in which actually it's a demyelinating disease, in which there is a loss of myelin sheath in the nervous system at many places. So what happened is actually due to loss of myelin sheath, here you can see that there is a myelin sheath, but here the myelin sheath is absent. Okay, so it is damaged actually in a disease which is known as multiple sclerosis. So what will happen, that the conduction velocity is going to slow at this point. So what happens, that's why the person with the multiple sclerosis has complaints of muscle weakness, fatigue and difficulty with walking. Okay, now let's discuss the properties of action potential. The action potentials have got many properties, and the most important of all properties is the all or none principle, or all or nothing principle, and the refractory period, which has got two phases, absolute and relative refractory period. So we will discuss both of these. The all or nothing principle says that action potential occur in all or none fashion depending on the strength of the stimulus. Now what is all or none? So now let's discuss the all or none principle, or all or nothing principle. Now what does this principle state? That if any portion of the membrane is depolarized to threshold, an action potential will be fired and it will go to its maximum height. Beyond that it cannot go. Okay, it has a maximum height of about till plus 35. It will go till plus 35, and then it is going to finish. So this we can see, these are the sub-threshold stimuli, so they do not elicit action potential because the threshold is not reached. But here, once the threshold stimulus is provided, the membrane potential reaches the threshold value and the action potential is fired and it goes to the maximum limit. So if sub-threshold stimulus, action potential is not going to fired, and if threshold or if there is a supra threshold stimulus, if it is more stronger stimulus is given, that the membrane potential is actually above the threshold value, then even the action potential will occur, and it occur at the same height. It will not produce a larger action potential. Okay, just imagine that you are firing a gun. What will happen when you pull the trigger? When the trigger is not pulled sufficiently, what will happen? The bullet is not going to fire. Means the threshold is not reached. But when you pull the trigger half harder enough to elicit the full firing, what will happen? That means that the bullet is going to fire, and the means that the threshold is reached. But when you pull the trigger much harder, what will happen? It will not produce a greater explosion. Okay, only that bullet will be fired. Okay, so it's just like this, that when there is a subthreshold stimulus, action potential is not going to occur. When stimulus is at threshold or suprathreshold, action potential will be fired and it will go to its maximum height. Suprathreshold stimuli, they are not going to produce larger action potential. Uh, But if the triggering agent fails to depolarize the membrane to threshold, action potential is not going to fire. So this is known as all or none principle. Either the action potential occurs or it does not occur, depend on the strength of the stimulus. Now, what is the importance of all or none principle? Or it's again the definition that excitable membrane either respond to a triggering agent with maximal action potential, which then spread throughout the membrane in a non-decremental manner, or it does not respond with an action potential at all. So this is known as all or none law, all or none principle, all or nothing principle. They are not the same name. Okay. So what is the importance of this all or none principle? Actually, it allows the discrimination between important and unimportant stimuli. If the stimulus is too weak to bring the membrane to the threshold, the action potential is not going to be fired and therefore do not transmit the signals. Actually, we experience a lot of sensory signals, but every sensory signal does not go to the brain, or otherwise our brain would only be responsible for getting these sensory signals, and it won't be able to do some other functions, other creative functions. Okay, so 99% of our senses, of our sensations, they are lost before they go to the brain, because they are unimportant and they do not make the membrane to a threshold potential. So action potential is not fired and it is not travel up to the brain. So most of our sensory signals, they die out before they reach to the brain, and this is very important, that it helps in the discrimination between important and unimportant stimuli. The second property of the action potential is the refractory period. The word refractory means stubborn or unresponsive. A new action potential cannot occur in an excitable membrane as long as the membrane is still depolarized from the preceding action potential. Means if one action potential is going on, the second action potential cannot occur in that excitable membrane. Okay, so this is the definition of refractory period. It has got two phases. So what is refractory period? Is the period during which the second action potential cannot occur if the first action potential is still going on, or the membrane is still depolarized from the preceding action potential. So two phases, the absolute refractory phase and the relative refractory phase. How you define the absolute refractory period? The absolute refractory period is the period during which a second action potential cannot occur no matter how great the stimulus is. It lasts for entire duration of action potential. Here you can see start of the action potential from this from minus 90 graded potential and all these, then it plus 35, and then this red, this pink portion, actually this pink one, it is showing the period of absolute refractory period, and it is entire duration of action potential. You can see that during the entire duration, almost entire duration, you can see that the second action potential, if you give a stimulus over here, for example, this stimulus is given here and the action potential start. If this stimulus is again given, a second action potential will not occur at these points, okay, because the membrane is actually depolarized and it cannot be depolarized again. So because you know that the inactivation gates of the voltage gated sodium channels, they are closed due to depolarization. At the peak of depolarization, you know that the voltage inactivation gate of the voltage gated sodium channels, they are closed, and they remain closed until the cell is repolarized back to the RMP at or near the resting membrane potential. Near the resting membrane potential, these sodium channels, this inactivation gates, they do open and the activation gates close, if you remember. So due to the inactivation of the voltage gated sodium channels, the second action potential cannot be generated because the voltage gated sodium channels, they are closed. So this phase is known as absolute refractory phase, and you understand that what is the cause of its occurrence, because the inactivation gates of the voltage gated of the voltage gated sodium channels, they are closed. Okay. The phase is the relative refractory period. This blue area is the relative refractory period. Any stimulus given at this point, if, for example, if it is given at this point, at this point, at this point, what happens that it actually begin at the end of absolute refractory period, and it actually overlap with the period of hyperpolarization. You can see that it is mostly in the period of hyperpolarization. Here, how you define the relative refractory period? It's the period during which the second action potential can occur in the presence of the first action potential if stronger than normal stimuli is given. Means the stimulus should be at the suprathreshold level. If higher stimulus is given, stronger stimulus is given, the second action potential can be elicited. Now, why is it so that here the voltage gated potassium channels are open, so it creates more negativity and we get a state of hyperpolarization. So we are far away from the threshold, so you need a greater stimulus strength so to reach to the threshold value. This is minus 100, and threshold, it's a neuron, so it's minus 80, not minus 100, it's minus 80, and threshold is at about near about minus 55. So our membrane is more negative in the in the hyperpolarization phase. It's more negative due to slow closure of voltage gated potassium channel. So to bring that more negative to the threshold value, we require the strength of the stimulus to be greater as compared to the stimulus which we need at the RMP. So with the greater strength of stimulus, the membrane can again have a new action potential, and this one action potential is already going on, but still we can have one other action potential if the stimulus strength is greater. Okay, now let's see the importance of refractory period. It is actually important for limiting the frequency of action potentials. Okay, because the membrane, soon after the action potential starts, it goes into its refractory period. So another action potential cannot occur. So it limits the frequency of action potential, and which prevents the phenomena of fatigue. Cardiac muscles, they have got a long refractory period. That's why the cardiac muscle does not fatigue. Second thing, it helps in one-way propagation of action potential. The refractory period helps in one-way propagation of action potential. How? We discussed that the action potential started at this area and now it has moved forward. Now this area has reached a threshold and has fired the action potential. Now this area, the area immediately behind this is the previous active area, and now it has returned to its RMP by the opening of voltage gated potassium channel. So what is happening here, that the membrane behind this ongoing action potential, the membrane behind this is refractory because of the inactivation of the voltage gated sodium channels. That's why the action potential which this action potential which is occurring in this active area will not move backward, because the membrane in the this previously area, this previous action potential area is refractory, and it cannot generate another action potential because of inactivation of the sodium channel. So it is going to move only in this forward direction, and it is going helping in one way propagation of the action potential. Okay, this slide is showing the basic differences between the properties of graded and action potential. So, if we talk about the potential, it serves as a long distance signals, and graded potential serve as short distance signals. Action potential travels in non-decremental manner, and graded potential travels in decremental fashion. Action potential cannot be summated, but graded potential can be summated. Action potential obeys all or none law. Graded potential does not obey all or none law. Action potential has refractory period. It has no refractory period. Action potential does not depend on the strength. It occurs at constant amplitude. It does not depend on the strength of the stimulus. If the threshold is reached, it is going to fire. But the graded potential depends on the strength of the stimulus. That's why it's named as graded potential. Action potential occurs due to opening and closing of the voltage gated channels, and graded potential occurs due to opening of ligand, thermal, or mechanically gated channels. Action potential occurs usually on the axon. Graded potential is triggered on the soma and dendrites.
Hey guys, welcome to today's MCAT question of the day. As always, we will be working our way through one of the mini MCAT practice problems found at mcatselfprep.com, the home of the free MCAT prep course. I'm Andrew George, a 99th percentile MCAT tutor, and I'll be walking you through today's practice problem as if you're one of my private tutoring students. Be sure to hit pause and try this practice problem for yourself before watching my explanation. To start off answering this practice problem, we first need to understand the difference between a graded potential and an action potential. A graded potential is like dropping a rock in a pond. At the center of where you drop the rock, the waves are going to be much higher than the outer periphery of where you dropped that rock, right? So the further away you get from where you dropped the rock, the waves are smaller and smaller and smaller. That's how it is with the graded potential. The spot where it starts is a very high change in membrane potential, but as you get further and further away from the spot where it started, it decreases in strength. An action potential, on the other hand, it does not decrease in strength over time. It's a membrane potential that's propagated in an absolute fashion that does not decrease in strength. For instance, if a neurotransmitter binds to the dendrites of this neuron, that might cause some ion channels to open. For instance, maybe a sodium ion channel opens, causing sodium ions to rush in. And let's pretend that those sodium ions cause the membrane potential to increase by plus 30 over here at the dendrites, okay? But the further away I get from that spot, the smaller that membrane potential will change. For instance, in this area, it'll probably only increase by 20. In this area, it'll probably only increase by 10. And by the time you get to the axon hillock, it'll probably only increase by 5. And so let me ask you, is this going to cause an action potential? No, most likely not, because in order to cause an action potential, you need to go from the resting membrane potential, which is about negative 70 millivolts, to about negative 50 to negative 55. So we need an increase of more like plus 15 to plus 20 in order to cause a action potential at the axon hillock, right? So let's pretend, though, that this was strong enough and it did give us a plus 15 increase in our membrane potential, causing the membrane potential to go to about negative 55, causing an action potential at this spot, at the axon hillock. That means we're going to get a action potential here. We're going to get an action potential here, action potential here, action potential all the way down until we reach the axon terminals, right? And an action potential is always the same strength. You can't have an action potential that's stronger than another action potential. They always follow the same pattern of going from negative 55 millivolts to about plus 30 millivolts and then back down to what they were before. That's an action potential. You can't have a stronger one where it goes all the way up to plus 60 millivolts or something like that. It's just, that's not how we think of action potentials. We think about them being the same exact strength as other action potentials. And so this here, we talked about is action potential. This here is a graded action potential. Let's take another look at the question stem. Transient membrane potentials, also called graded potentials, right? That's what we talked about. Graded potentials can occur at which of the following locations? Dendrite? Yes. We talked about that. That's where the graded potential will start, and it'll decrease over time as it travels through the soma. So yeah, soma is also where you might find a graded potential. But the axon, that's where we find action potentials. Therefore, you don't think about the axon as having a graded potential. Therefore, the answer to this question is A, 1 and 2 only. If you liked this MCAT question of the day, be sure to give it a like. And for more MCAT questions of the day, be sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel and enroll in our free MCAT prep course found at mcatselfprep.com. And if you are really looking to maximize your MCAT score, feel free to visit my tutoring profile page and request a free 10-minute phone consultation. I'd love to chat with you about your situation and how you can maximize your MCAT score. I look forward to hearing from you soon, and we'll see you next time.
So let's do some MCQs. During depolarization phase of action potential, what is happening? Sodium flows outward, potassium flows inward, sodium flows inward, or potassium flows outwards. Now during the depolarization phase, the voltage gated sodium channels open and sodium flows inwards. So correct answer is C, sodium flows. Another BCQ is depolarization is due to rapid influx of sodium ions, rapid efflux of sodium ions, rapid influx of potassium ions, or rapid efflux of potassium ions. As we know that the depolarization is due to rapid efflux of potassium ions and restoring the resting membrane potential. Hyperpolarization is due to increased conductance of potassium, sodium, chloride, or calcium. Hyperpolarization is due to increased conductance of potassium due to slow closure of potassium channels, voltage gated potassium channels. Which of the following is involved in maintaining the RLP? Outward potassium current, outward sodium current, inward sodium current, or sodium potassium pump. You all know that word maintenance of the RLP is actually this maintenance of RLP is done by the sodium potassium pump. Yes, another MCQ, sudden decrease in serum calcium is associated with decreased excitability of nerve and muscle, increased excitability of muscle and nerve, no change in excitability, and membrane remains in resting state. So decrease serum. Low serum means hypocalcemia. Hypocalcemia, voltage gated sodium channels, they are excited with little change in membrane potential. So it means there is increased excitability of the nerve and muscle, which leads to muscle spasm, and this condition is known as tetany, and it is this condition occurs when there is low serum calcium. Thank you, students. Thanks for listening. As already mentioned, this is the 5th chapter of Guyton and action potential. I have covered 2 lectures in one presentation. Stay safe, and if you have any queries, you can ask me on my email. Thank you. Thanks for listening.